The chair scraped against the marble floor when she stood up, and the sound of it cut through the room like a blade. No one moved, not the man at the head of the table, who had just told her, in front of 43 people, in front of his mother, and his brother, and his college roommates, and the woman from his firm who laughed too loudly at everything he said, that she should be grateful he'd given her a seat at this table at all. Not his sister, Paige, who had been watching from across the room with an expression that landed somewhere between pity and satisfaction. Not the couple nearest to her, whose names she had learned and relearned and learned again over 7 years of dinners exactly like this one, because neither of them had ever made the effort to remember hers. The chair had scraped, and everyone had heard it, and no one had done a single thing. Her name was Lynnette Boateng, but the people in that room had never really used it. To them she was Brandon's wife, or Brandon's companion. Or, when they didn't know she could hear them, the phrase she had overheard at the very first Hargrove family gathering she'd ever attended, standing in the hallway outside the kitchen at the Hargrove estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. Holding a glass of sparkling water she had poured herself because no one had offered. The woman he brought. That was 7 years ago. She was 31 then. She was 38 now, and the chair had just scraped across the marble, and she was standing, and the room was very quiet. The Hargroves were the kind of family that had been wealthy. For so long they had forgotten what it felt like to want something and not have it. Brandon's grandfather had built a shipping company. His father had turned it into a logistics empire. Brandon himself had done nothing particularly remarkable except inherit the right temperament for rooms like this one. Easy confidence, a laugh that arrived at exactly the correct moment, the ability to say very little while appearing to say a great deal. He was 44. He had gone to Dartmouth. He had a jaw like something carved from a mountain and hands that looked like they belonged in a magazine advertisement. And he had met Lynnette at a conference in Atlanta. She had been the keynote speaker. He had been in the audience. And he had told her 3 months later over dinner at a restaurant she had to look up to confirm was real, that she was unlike anyone he had ever met. She had believed him. That was where it started. The conference was on innovation in financial technology. Lynnette was the founder and CEO of a software company she had built from a single idea in a studio apartment in Baltimore when she was 26 years old, working 2 jobs, eating rice and frozen vegetables 4 nights a week, writing code at a kitchen table she'd found on the sidewalk. By the time she met Brandon, her company, Novara Systems, had contracts with 3 of the 7 largest banks in the United States, an evaluation that the financial press described consistently as unexpected. That word always appeared, unexpected. What they meant and never quite said was unexpected for someone like her, a black woman from West Baltimore. A woman who had grown up sharing a bedroom with 2 sisters in a row house on Presbury Street, whose mother worked nights, whose father she had last seen when she was 9 years old and had not spent significant time wondering about since. The financial press called it unexpected. The Hargroves, when they bothered to think about it at all, simply chose not to think about it. She had met Brandon's mother, Claudette, for the first time at a dinner in New York, 4 months into dating. Claudette had arrived in ivory cashmere and introduced herself to the hostess, to the man standing beside the hostess, to a woman across the room she vaguely recognized from somewhere, and then finally, to Lynnette, with a smile that was technically present and emotionally absent, and the words, "Brandon tells me you work in computers." Lynnette had said yes. She ran a software company. Claudette had said, "How interesting," and then turned to ask Brandon about a property he was looking at in the Hamptons. That was dinner number 1. The first year of the marriage, they married 18 months after the conference, was the year of small erasures. At the Hargrove family Christmas, the photographer arranged everyone on the grand staircase of the Greenwich house. Brandon's sister and her husband on one step, Brandon's brother, Trent, and his girlfriend on another. Claudette at the center of it all, arranged with the precision of a woman who had spent her life understanding exactly where she should be standing at any given moment. Lynnette was on the far right of the bottom step. The first arrangement, she noticed, had placed her slightly outside the frame. The photographer, a young man who kept apologizing for the light, had said nothing. Brandon had noticed. He had not said anything either. He had put his hand on her back and guided her to a different spot, but the different spot was still the far right, still slightly outside. And when the final photograph arrived 3 weeks later in a gold-embossed card, Lynnette counted the faces. She was there. Just barely. She had smiled at that photograph for a long time. The second year was the year of comparisons that weren't quite comparisons. Trent's girlfriend is just so warm, isn't she? You know she volunteers at the hospital. She doesn't have to. It's not like they need the money, but she just loves people. Brandon's ex-girlfriend had the most incredible gift for these kinds of evenings. She just knew how to make everyone feel at home. Some people are naturals, I suppose. These were things Claudette said to Lynnette, or near Lynnette, or at the general vicinity of Lynnette, in the same tone she used to discuss the flower arrangements. Conversational, ambient, like notes of music in a room you couldn't turn off. Lynnette smiled. She was good at smiling. She had learned, in rooms very different from these, that the smile was sometimes the only thing standing between you and what people actually wanted to see. The third year was the year the comments about her hair began. It was at a spring luncheon on the Hargrove property in Connecticut. The garden was immaculate, the way only very expensive gardens were immaculate. Tended by people you never saw. The women were in linen and silk. Lynnette was wearing a dress she had found in Milan, and a pair of earrings her mother had sent her for her birthday. Gold and slightly too large, the kind of earrings that were not fashionable, but were hers. Brandon's aunt, a woman named Charlotte who had been introduced to Lynnette 4 separate times across 4 separate events, and had never once retained her name, leaned across the table and said, "Do you find it difficult with your hair? I imagine the humidity is just terrible for it." Lynnette had looked at her. "My hair is fine." Charlotte had smiled the way you smile at a child who has misunderstood a joke. "Of course it is. I just meant, well, it must take so much effort. You must be very committed." Brandon was talking to someone else. Lynnette had looked down at her plate and cut a piece of salmon into pieces smaller than necessary. She had eaten the salmon. She had smiled for the remainder of the luncheon. She had driven home with Brandon and watched him sleep on the plane and thought, for the first time, but not the last and thought, about what it would mean to leave. She did not leave. What she did instead was work. Novara Systems opened its 4th regional office the following spring. It signed a contract with a federal agency that the trade publications called a landmark deal. Lynnette appeared on the cover of Forbes in November. The issue with the dark background and the white text that her assistant had framed and sent to her home, which she had kept in her office at Novara and not brought to the Hargrove house in Connecticut, where she and Brandon spent most of their time. The Hargroves did not mention the Forbes cover. Not Claudette, not Trent, not Charlotte, not Brandon's college roommates, or the woman from his firm, or the couple who never remembered her name. Brandon mentioned it once, briefly, and said he was proud of her, and then mentioned that his brother had been passed over for a promotion. And it was clearly a political situation, and really not fair at all. She had agreed that it wasn't fair. She was good at that too. The annual Hargrove family gathering was held every summer at the estate in Greenwich. 40 to 60 guests, depending on the year. A combination of family, friends, and people whose presence indicated something about the family's standing, without those people being quite close enough to count as intimates. This year, there were 43 guests. There was a federal judge, the Honorable Bertram Falks, who had been appointed to the circuit court 12 years prior and who had the practiced stillness of a man accustomed to other people performing for him. There was a state senator from Connecticut, a woman named Patricia Weston, who wore sensible shoes and had the kind of handshake that suggested she had been practicing it for 30 years. There was Brandon's business partner, a man named Cole Whitfield, who laughed at Brandon's jokes with the reliability of a metronome, and who had once, at a dinner in the second year of the marriage, looked directly at Lynnette when she was speaking, and then turned to Brandon to ask what she had just said. There were cousins, and college friends, and neighbors, and the couple, Graham and Elsa Doyle, who had lived next to the Greenwich estate for 15 years, and who had, across 7 years of Lynnette attending this gathering, never once gotten her name right. They called her Yvette. They called her Linda. At one point they had called her Lauren, and when she had gently corrected them, Elsa had said, of course, I always do that. I'm terrible with names." She was not, Lynnette had noticed, terrible with anyone else's name. This year the dinner was outdoors. Long tables under white linen, the garden lit with the amber light of lanterns. The kind of evening that was designed to look effortless because enormous amounts of money had been spent making it look effortless. Lynnette was seated 3 seats from the head of the table, which was where Claudette always sat, which was fine. She was wearing a dress the color of midnight, not black exactly, more the blue that the sky becomes a few minutes before dark, and her hair was natural, and she had worn it that way on purpose, the way she wore it to board meetings and investor presentations and the interview with Forbes, because it was hers, and she had stopped apologizing for it 2 years into the marriage and had not started again. The dinner began well enough, if you did not look closely. The salmon was served. The conversation moved between the property market and a hurricane that had barely touched the coast and a fundraiser that Charlotte was co-chairing in the fall. Lynnette answered the questions directed at her, which were few, and smiled at the comments made near her, which were many, and refilled her own water glass, because the server had refilled everyone else's twice without reaching hers. Cole Whitfield told a story about a deal he'd closed in Singapore. Senator Weston talked about a piece of legislation that was making its way through committee. Judge Fawkes listened to both with an expression that suggested he was somewhere else entirely. And then Brandon, who had drunk more than he should have. She had noticed this at about 7:15, which was about 2 drinks before anyone else would have noticed. Leaned back in his chair and said, loudly enough for the table to hear, that Lynnette was too serious, that she never just relaxed and enjoyed herself, that she always had to make everything a whole thing. She had said, quietly, "I'm enjoying myself." He had said, "You have that look." She had said, "I don't have a look," he had said louder now, the warmth from the wine sharpening into something edged. "You always do this. You make people uncomfortable." She had said, "Brandon." And he had turned to her fully, the chair rotating, his voice dropping into something that was somehow worse than the loudness, more contained and more deliberate, and said, "I let you come to these things. I let you be here. You could be a little more grateful for that." The table was quiet, not just their end of the table. The whole table. She could feel 43 people arranging their expressions. She could feel the senator looking at the tablecloth. She could feel Charlotte doing something with her napkin. She could feel Cole Whitfield making a decision, across the table, about whether he was going to say anything. He was not going to say anything. None of them were. And then Brandon's hand moved. She saw it in her peripheral vision, the way you sometimes see something you already know is coming. Not as a surprise, but as the arrival of something that had been traveling toward you for a long time. His palm struck the side of her face, open-handed, not with his full strength, but with enough. Enough to turn her head, enough to knock her earring, one of the gold ones, the ones her mother had sent, out and send it skipping across the marble of the outdoor terrace. The sound of it was very small, smaller than the silence that followed it. She did not cry. She had trained herself, over many years, not to respond to pain in front of people who were watching for exactly that response. She straightened. She put her hand to the side of her face, not dramatically, just briefly, the way you check something. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who had not quite expected himself to do that, but had already decided he wasn't going to be the first to speak. The senator said, "Brandon, just that, his name, nothing else." Trent, Brandon's brother, seated 4 chairs down, laughed. A short sound, not quite a laugh, more the sound a person makes when they are uncomfortable and have decided to style it as amusement. He said, "Guess she knows which end of the table matters." No one responded to that either. Lynnette stood up. That was when the chair scraped. She did not say anything when she stood. She did not cry. She did not deliver the speech that existed, fully formed and articulate, somewhere in the part of her that had been drafting it for 7 years. She simply stood and reached down and picked up the gold earring from the marble and put it back in her ear and walked inside. She walked through the living room of the Greenwich estate, past the oil painting of Brandon's grandfather that hung above the fireplace, past the console table where Claudette always arranged white flowers in a crystal vase, through the hallway and into the small study at the back of the house that had bad light and too many books, and was the only room in this house where Lynnette had ever felt slightly, cautiously at ease. She called her assistant, Joelle, who picked up on the second ring because Joelle always picked up on the second ring and had done so for 6 years without Lynnette ever having to ask. She said, "I need a car, and I need you to contact David." David was her attorney. He had been her attorney since Novara's second year, when a competitor had tried to challenge a patent, and David had dismantled the challenge so completely that the story had made the rounds in tech legal circles for the better part of a year. Joelle said, 20 minutes. I'll have him call you in the morning. She said, tonight. Joelle said, give me 5. She sat in the study and looked at the books she had never read, belonging to a family that had never quite accepted her, in a house she had tried for 7 years to make feel like somewhere she belonged. The light was bad. The chair she sat in was slightly too small. Outside, through the window, she could see the amber glow of the lanterns and the shapes of 43 people who had watched her husband strike her and had decided, collectively, that the correct response was nothing. Her face still felt warm on the left side. She did not touch it again. She thought about her mother's house on Presbury Street. She thought about the kitchen table she had found on the sidewalk, the one she had written the first version of Novara's core architecture on at 2 in the morning, with a cup of coffee going cold beside her keyboard. She thought about the night she had gotten the call about the first bank contract. She had been standing in a parking lot in Baltimore, and she had stayed perfectly still for a long time, alone. And then she had gotten in her car and driven home and called her mother and cried, properly, for about 4 minutes, and then she had made a list of everything she needed to do next. She was good at lists. She was good at what came next. The car arrived in 18 minutes. She walked out through the front door without going back to the dinner. She did not say goodbye to Claudette. She did not say goodbye to Brandon, who had followed her inside at some point. She had heard his footsteps in the hallway, and then had not knocked on the study door, which told her everything she needed to know about the particular flavor of his regret. She got in the car. She did not look back at the house. What happened next did not happen immediately. It happened the way things happen when they have been building for a long time, in stages with pauses between them that felt like stillness but were actually accumulation. David filed the separation papers within the week. Brandon's attorneys contested the process in the particular way that wealthy people contest things when they know they are wrong, but have access to people whose job it is to make wrongness expensive for the other party. Lynnette did not find this surprising. She found it clarifying. The police had been called, the night of the gathering, not by the 43 guests, but by the head of the catering staff. A woman named Darlene, who had been standing just inside the door to the kitchen when it happened, and who had taken out her phone and made the call before anyone at the table had finished arranging their expressions. She had given a statement. She had been, in the weeks that followed, the only witness who came forward without being asked twice. Senator Weston gave a statement eventually. She had contacted David's office 9 days after the incident, and the statement she gave was careful and complete, and had clearly been reviewed by her own legal counsel before it was submitted. Judge Falk said nothing publicly. This was noted by several people. Trent's comment, "Guess she knows which end of the table matters," was mentioned in the police report because Darlene had heard it too, standing inside the door, holding a tray of desserts she had never ended up serving. The quarter-end earnings report for Novara Systems was scheduled to be presented at a financial conference in Manhattan. 4 months after the gathering in Greenwich, Lynnette had been scheduled to present it herself, which was unusual. Most CEOs sent a CFO for quarterly presentations, but she had always preferred to speak for the company directly, because she had built it, and she knew it in the way you know something that came from you, bone deep, and without having to think. She presented it herself. The auditorium held approximately 300 people, investment analysts, fund managers, financial press. Several of the analysts who covered Novara had been doing so for years and knew, as a matter of professional record, that the company's growth trajectory over the prior 7 years had been among the most consistent in its sector. She walked to the podium in a charcoal suit and the gold earrings, both of them, and she presented the numbers. The numbers were good. The numbers were, in fact, exceptional. A 41% year-over-year increase in enterprise contracts, 2 new federal agreements, and the formal announcement of an acquisition that had been in negotiation for 8 months and that she had not mentioned publicly until this moment. The room responded, the way rooms respond to numbers like that. She did not mention the gathering in Greenwich. She did not need to. What had happened in Greenwich had already been covered. First in a local Connecticut paper, then in a legal trade publication, then in the kind of place where things become impossible to contain. The details were there for anyone who had been paying attention. The gathering, the comments, the strike, the 43 guests, the catering staff member who made the call, the senator's eventual statement. The headline that had spread furthest, the one that had been shared and reshared, and that appeared, the morning of the conference, on a screen in the lobby of the building where the conference was being held, cycling through the day's financial news, read, Novara Systems CEO Lynnette Boateng to present record quarter, amid domestic incident involving estranged husband. The screen was visible from the registration desk. Cole Whitfield was at the conference. He was there, representing Brandon's firm, which had a minor investment in a company presenting later in the day. He walked into the lobby, and he looked at the registration desk, and then he looked at the screen, and then he looked at Lynnette's name on the conference program he was holding in his hand, and he stood there for a moment with an expression that was difficult to describe precisely, but that landed somewhere in the vicinity of a man realizing, too late, the size of something he had previously chosen not to see. Elsa Doyle, who had also been invited, her husband Graham ran a fund that attended these events annually, walked in 30 seconds behind him. She looked at the screen, she looked at the program, she looked at the name, Boateng, which she had never managed to retain across 7 years of annual dinners, and which was now in 48-point font on a sign above the main conference entrance. She stood very still. Charlotte, who had been informed of the quarter's results by a financial advisor that morning, and was not at the conference, but had been forwarded the headline by 3 separate people, before 10 a.m. called Brandon. Brandon did not answer. The presentation lasted 40 minutes. Lynnette did not rush it. She had never rushed a presentation in her professional life, and she was not going to start now. At the end of it, during the question period, an analyst from a firm she had known for years raised his hand and asked about the acquisition, timing, integration strategy, anticipated impact on the enterprise segment. She answered precisely. She answered completely. She answered the way. She answered everything, which was with the particular clarity of someone who had spent a long time in rooms where people expected her to be less than she was, and had long since decided that clarity was not a performance but a practice. After the questions, the moderator thanked her. The room applauded. Several people stood. She walked off the stage, and Joelle was there, with a bottle of water and a folder of what came next, because there was always a next, because Lynnette had always been good at that. The next thing, the list, the morning after the worst night, the thing you build from the sidewalk table at 2 a.m, when no one is watching and no one expects anything from you. And the only reason you keep going is because the idea is real, and you are the only one who can make it. She took the water. She opened the folder. She read the first item on the list. Brandon's attorneys had proposed a settlement offer that morning. David had flagged it with a note. Worth reviewing. They are, I think, beginning to understand the situation. She read the number. She put the folder back in Joelle's hands. She said, "Tell David we'll counter." Joelle said, "At what?" She said a number that was not the one Brandon's attorneys had proposed. Joelle made a note. She did not ask whether Lynnette was sure, because she had worked for Lynnette long enough to know that when Lynnette said a number, she had already done the math. Outside, through the tall windows of the convention center, Manhattan was the color of late morning. The light was coming off the buildings the way it did at this hour, angled and particular, the kind of light that made everything look like it was being seen clearly for the first time. She had a lunch meeting at 12:30, a call with her COO at 2, and a conversation with the acquisition team at 4 that she had been looking forward to for 8 months. She put on her coat, she straightened the collar. She touched the gold earring, briefly, with 2 fingers, the one that had been knocked across the marble of the Greenwich Terrace, the one that was her mother's, the one she had put back in her ear while 43 people watched and said nothing. It was still there. She had always known it would be.